I'm Frank Ackerman. I'm the director of the Climate Economics Group at the Stockholm Environment Institute and also a senior research fellow at the Global Development and Environment Institute here at Tufts University. And I'm here today with Nick Stern, the lead author of the Stern Review of Climate Change, who's here at Tufts to receive the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers in economic thought, jointly with Martin Weitzman. And we're happy to have the chance to ask him a few questions before the talk. What changes in economics are needed to understand issues with immense consequence like climate change?
We have to be in the consequences of climate change. We have to try to imagine and work with the scientists to try to get a little more specific. Totally specific's not on offer, but a little bit more specific on just how intense the consequences of 4 or 5 or 6 degrees temperatures. There are some people who appear to think that 4 or 5 or 6 degree centigrade increases relative to the 19th century are just a few percentage points off GDP. That doesn't begin to get to grips with a transformation and take us to temperatures this planet hasn't seen for 30 million years, and where basically our civilization date from the last ice age 10 million years ago. 10 million versus 30 million, sorry, 10,000 last ice age versus 30 million since we've last seen 5 degrees centigrade on this planet. These are huge changes, and I think we have to explain much more clearly just how radical a transformation of that kind in perhaps 100 years of historical time might be to where we can live, how we can live our lives. Population movements, probably hundreds of millions, will have to move. I think we have to get to grips with analysing consequences way outside the kind of consequences you normally look at, way outside. We normally look at when we're thinking about policy analysis. On the other hand, if we're talking about what it takes to promote action, what we're really talking about is policies to foster over the next 2 or 3 decades a pretty radical industrial revolution. Now my view is that such a revolution is rather attractive story in terms of creativity, innovation, and of course the fruits of low carbon growth in terms of energy security, biodiversity, cleaner, safer ways of living. But on the one hand it's describing immense changes in a way that we get our heads around the economics, which is very unusual in our subject, well, unprecedented in our subject, and the other is the dynamics of industrial change, which most of our economic policy is mostly sort of a comparative static variety. These are quite radical changes in our subject.
In the optimistic months before the Copenhagen conference, you published a book outlining a new global deal on climate change. After the failure of the negotiations at Copenhagen and Cancun, is that new global deal still relevant?
It is still relevant. What happened at Copenhagen and Cancun was disappointing but not failure. What you got initially in the Copenhagen Accord, which was a pretty scrappy affair and put together in a sort of rather chaotic and quarrelsome environment in Copenhagen, what you got in Cancun was many of the ideas in the Copenhagen Accord transformed into broad international agreement. Now, this isn't a tremendous success by anybody's standards, it's rather disappointing.
Right. In
many ways, but it's much better than nothing. The emissions targets for 2020 are roughly 2/3 of the way between business as usual in 2020 and where we would need to be for a path which we call a 2-degree path, a 50-50 chance of holding temperature increases to 2 degrees above 19th century levels. So 2/3 of the way, if everybody delivers, of course. Now that's worth having. The discussions on deforestation with a few $1 billion behind deforestation programs in the tropical forest countries, that's worth having. The beginnings of a story of how to raise modest but significant sums for rich countries to help support transformation in poor countries, only $100 billion a year by 2020, which might be only 0.1 or 0.2% of rich country GDP by that time, but we've started work on how to generate those kinds of sums. Beginnings of agreement on how to measure emissions around the world in acceptable and verifiable ways. So we've made, actually, in these last 2 years or so, major steps forward, but it's been too slow and it's been disappointing. But the principles of agreement in terms of targets from different countries, in terms of how different countries support each other, which is what the Global Deal book was about, I think they're still highly relevant.
So finally, I'd like to ask you to think about American politics for a minute. Americans are among the world's richest people, and a global climate agreement will probably ask us to spend money helping other countries reduce emissions. But most Americans don't feel rich. Many have invested in houses in the suburbs, gas-guzzling cars for their long commutes. What does climate policy mean for them?
Now, one thing I've learned in my more than 40 years of discussing policy is that a British accent is not a great advantage in discussing policy for the USA. So I speak, I underline that I speak as a friendly person from the point of view of the United States, country which I lived in for a number of years and which I'm very fond of. But I'm not American, so it's not really for me to say what America should do or how Americans see things. So let me try to answer as somebody from another rich country, not quite as rich as the United States, but the UK, because similar kind of issues arise.
Sure.
The emissions in the United States per capita are about twice what they are in the UK, but those in the UK are perhaps 5 times what they need to be 30 or 40 years from now. So rich countries have similar kinds of problems. The first thing is to remind yourself you are rich, relative to the vast majority of this world and relative to your grandparents. The second is to recognise that the kind of sums involved in helping other countries might be about $1 in $1,000, that kind of sum. So it's not a huge sum relative to your income, maybe $2 in $1,000. That's the kind of scale of international support that the international community is discussing. The third point is that a lot of what we need to do is actually pretty attractive anyway. Energy efficiency is an extremely important part of the story. US cars, probably use twice as much as European cars. You get around fine in Europe. It's not as if you're sacrificing anything very much. And of course those emissions, and indeed gasoline consumption of cars, is dropping very rapidly. I mean, who would have thought that General Motors would be making an electric car? Who 5 years ago would have thought that? So I would underline, don't underestimate the creativity of US industry and industries elsewhere in really bringing down energy consumption. And of course it's a big advantage. Same with homes. UK homes are very inefficient, US homes are not that efficient. There's a great deal you can do with fairly modest investments. It makes a lot of sense anyway. And finally, this different way of doing things would involve a bit of investment now, but it has tremendous returns in energy security. Who wants to depend on the world market for oil? It has huge returns in biodiversity. It has great returns in terms of clean air and quietness and safety. So these are changes which we can't do overnight, but these are changes which are on balance pretty attractive changes to make, and I believe that US ingenuity and creativity is likely to lead the charge around the world in discovering and implementing these new ways of doing things. So I think that if you look at it analytically and quietly, in terms of the kind of changes we have to do, you have to recognise they're radical and they're big, but also pretty attractive and worth making the investment in.